April 5th, 1944. Bridgewater Medical Clinic, somewhere in eastern Tennessee. Dr. Evelyn Hartwell held the local newspaper, the Ridgecrest Herald, open to the obituaries section. 3 photographs in a row. 3 men's faces. 3 identical phrases. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 0, underscore, underscore. She was 40 years old, and for the past 15 years she had worked as a general practitioner in this small town that had sprung up almost overnight when the war started. She knew these faces. Not just knew them, she had seen them in her examination room over the past 6 months. Vernon Oakley, 37 years old, came in during October complaining of weakness and unexplained weight loss. Clifford Brennan, 39, November, same symptoms plus strange bruising appearing without injury. Marlon Hutchins, 35, January, bone pain, bleeding gums, teeth loosening. All 3 had died within 4 to 5 months of their first visit. Evelyn folded the newspaper and looked at her appointment book. The next patient was already waiting outside her door. When he walked in, when she saw his grayish complexion, the hollows under his eyes, and heard those familiar complaints about exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure, she understood this was only the beginning. But she didn't yet know that within 6 months, men in dark suits would sit across from her desk and explain that national security was more important than human lives. And that silence wasn't just a choice, it was the only way to stay alive. To understand how it all began, we need to go back 6 months, to that autumn day when Evelyn first heard the name of the facility that would haunt her nightmares. October 1943. The Bridgewater Medical Clinic occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, painted white with green shutters, surrounded by oak trees that had started dropping their leaves. Inside, it smelled of carbolic soap, cigarette smoke that clung to everything, and that particular medical odor composed of iodine, fear, and the sweet sick scent of illness. Evelyn's office was on the 2nd floor, the former master bedroom converted into an examination room. 2 tall windows overlooked the town square, where a war bonds poster hung outside the bank. The walls were papered in faded yellow roses. Her desk sat beneath one window, piled with patient files, prescription pads, and medical journals. Opposite stood an examination table covered in white paper, a folding screen, and a glass-fronted cabinet containing instruments. On the wall hung a poster encouraging citizens to grow victory gardens. Evelyn sat at her desk filling out a patient chart. Her handwriting was small and precise, developed over years of practice. She wore a simple navy dress under her white coat, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. No makeup, no jewelry except her mother's wedding band that she wore on her right hand. There was a knock at the door. Evelyn looked up. "Come in." A man entered, around 40, wearing work clothes and a cap he removed as he stepped inside. Vernon Oakley, as Evelyn learned from pulling his file, born 1906, machinist. He approached the desk with hesitant steps, as if uncertain he belonged there. "Have a seat," Evelyn gestured to the chair across from her. "What brings you in today?" Oakley sat, placed his cap on his lap, and hesitated. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, the type people called big-boned. But now his clothes hung loose on him, as though he'd recently lost considerable weight. "Quote 5, he began, not meeting her eyes. "Quote 6. Quote 7. Evelyn picked up her pen. "Quote 8. Quote 9. Quote 10. Evelyn made notes without looking up. Oakley was quiet, then nodded. He ran his hand along his ribs. When Oakley removed his shirt, Evelyn had to suppress a grimace. His collarbones protruded sharply, ribs visible beneath skin that had an unhealthy grayish-yellow cast, and on his arms and chest were small bruises, as if someone had poked him with fingers. She conducted her examination, palpated his lymph nodes, swollen, his liver, extending below the rib margin, spleen also enlarged. She recorded all of this in his chart, keeping her expression neutral. "Quote 17, she asked when Oakley had dressed. "Quote 18. Quote 19. Oakley hesitated again. Quote 20. Evelyn knew about the massive industrial complex that had been built just outside Bridgewater 3 years ago, in 1940, right when the war in Europe was heating up. The government had bought up thousands of acres, displaced families, and constructed what they called a, quote, 21. Officially, it was listed as manufacturing munitions components. Everyone knew it was more than that, but no one talked about specifics. Security was tight. Workers signed documents promising never to discuss their jobs. The phrase, quote, _22_ was taken deadly seriously there. Oakley shrugged. Evelyn knew that milk distribution was standard at many industrial plants working with toxic materials. The calcium was supposed to help the body eliminate heavy metals. Evelyn began filling out forms. Oakley took the forms, turned them over in his hands. Evelyn said carefully. He nodded, stood, put his cap back on, and left. Evelyn sat at her desk, staring at the completed chart. The symptoms were troubling. Weakness, weight loss, bone pain, enlarged liver and spleen, petechial bruising, all pointed to a possible blood disorder. But she couldn't make a definitive diagnosis without laboratory results. She sighed and pressed the buzzer for her next patient. Over the next 2 weeks, Oakley completed all his tests. The results arrived in late October, and when Evelyn opened the envelope containing his blood work, her hand involuntarily clenched. Hemoglobin 7.8 grams per deciliter, normal range 13 to 16. White blood cells 2,100 per microliter, normal 4,000 to 9,000. Platelets 45,000 per microliter, normal 180,000 to 320,000. Pancytopenia. All cell lines were dangerously low, and in the differential count, abnormal cells. She called Oakley in for a follow-up appointment. He came 3 days later, looking even more haggard, with dark circles under his eyes. Vernon, Evelyn spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. You have serious abnormalities in your blood. You need to be admitted to the hospital in Knoxville immediately, today if possible. He stared at her uncomprehendingly. What do you mean? What's wrong with me? You have signs of a blood disease. The specialist at the hospital will need to do more tests to determine exactly what kind. But we can't wait. Is it cancer? His voice cracked. Not necessarily, Evelyn lied. There are other causes. Severe anemia, for instance. But you need to be evaluated right away. He sat silently, looking out the window where October rain was falling. Then he asked quietly, Is this from the plant? From my work? I don't know, Evelyn answered honestly. It's possible. Or it might not be related at all. That's something the specialists will investigate. Oakley took the hospital admission papers and left. Evelyn never saw him again. In November, a summary arrived from the hospital. Patient Vernon Oakley admitted to hematology service with diagnosis of acute myelogenous leukemia. Condition critical. Prognosis poor. In February 1944, his name appeared in the obituaries. But Vernon Oakley was not alone. In November, another man came to Evelyn's office. Clifford Brennan, 39, a supervisor at the Ridge plant. Same complaints. Crushing fatigue, weight loss, no appetite. When Evelyn examined him, she found the same signs: bruising, enlarged organs, pale skin. She ordered the same tests. The results were nearly identical. Pancytopenia, abnormal cells. She sent him to the hospital in Knoxville. Diagnosis: acute leukemia. He died in March. In December, Marlon Hutchins, 35 years old, equipment technician at Building K-27. Same story, same symptoms, same test results, same diagnosis. Dead by February. 3 men in 5 months, all working at the same facility, all in their 30s, all dying of acute leukemia. Evelyn sat in her office one evening after the last patient had left, with the 3 charts spread before her on her desk. The town outside was dark, illuminated only by the few streetlights that still operated under wartime dimming restrictions. She could see her reflection in the window. A tired woman in her 40s, sitting alone in a pool of lamplight, surrounded by evidence of something wrong. Very wrong. She opened her notebook and began writing. Patient 1, Vernon Oakley, 37, Building K 27, machinist. Symptoms began approximately July 1943. Died February 1944. 7 months from onset to death. Patient 2, Clifford Brennan, 39, Building K 27, supervisor. Symptoms began approximately August 1943. Died March 1944. 7 months. Patient 3, Marlon Hutchins, 35, Building K 27, technician. Symptoms began approximately October 1943. Died February 1944. 4 months. All 3 worked in Building K 27. All 3 developed acute leukemia. Statistical probability of 3 cases in a single small workplace by chance? Essentially 0. This was not coincidence. This was an occupational exposure. Evelyn closed the notebook and stared out the window. What she was thinking was impossible. If 3 men from the same workplace had died of the same rare disease in a matter of months, it meant there was something deadly in that workplace. Something that was killing them. And if these 3 had died, how many more were sick? How many more would die? The next morning, Evelyn made a telephone call to the Knox County Health Department. She identified herself as a physician and reported a cluster of leukemia cases among workers at a defense facility. The clerk on the other end took her information politely and said someone would get back to her. No one called back. A week later, Evelyn called again. This time she was transferred to a supervisor, a man named Patterson, who listened to her report and then asked, quote 40, quote 41, quote 42, quote 43, quote 44, quote 45, quote 46. Patterson's voice became firm. The Ridge plant operates under War Department security protocols. Medical information about workers at that facility is classified. I'm not at liberty to discuss it with civilian practitioners. I'm not asking for classified information. I'm reporting what appears to be an occupational health hazard, which we will investigate through appropriate channels. Thank you for your report, doctor. The line went dead. Evelyn sat holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone. Classified. Security protocols. War Department. She was being shut out. Politely, professionally, but completely shut out. 2 weeks later, a man came to her office. He didn't have an appointment. He simply appeared at her door at the end of the day, after the last patient had left. He wore a dark suit and introduced himself as Thomas Gaines from the War Production Board. Quote 50, quote, he said, taking the seat across from her desk without waiting to be invited. Quote 51, quote 52, quote 53, quote. He opened a briefcase and removed a folder. Quote 54, quote 55, quote 56, quote 57. Gaines smiled thinly. Quote 58, quote 59, quote 60. Evelyn leaned forward. Quote 62, quote 63, quote 64, quote 65. Gaines closed his folder. Quote 66, quote 67. Gaines stood. Quote 68. He paused at the door. Quote 69. He left. Evelyn sat alone in her office as darkness fell outside. The Espionage Act. Prison. She understood what had just happened. She had been warned. Silenced. Told to keep her mouth shut or face consequences. That night, Evelyn lay awake in her small apartment above the pharmacy. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mr. Eckhart's radio playing downstairs. News about Allied advances in Italy, about bomber raids over Germany. The war was everywhere. It justified everything. Sacrifice, secrecy, silence. The next morning, another patient came to her office. Randall Thorne, 41, electrician at Building K 27. Complaints: exhaustion, weight loss, bruising. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach as she conducted the examination. She knew what she would find even before she palpated his organs. Enlarged liver, enlarged spleen. She ordered blood work. When the results came back a week later, they confirmed what she already knew. Pancytopenia. Abnormal cells. She sat Thorne down in her office and explained that he needed to go to the hospital. "What is it, Doc?" he asked, his face gray. "I think you know what it is," she said quietly. "Same thing that killed Vernon and Cliff and Marlon. Same thing that's going to kill me." His eyes filled with tears. "I got 2 kids, doctor. Little girls, 8 and 6. What am I supposed to tell them?" "Tell them you love them. Tell them every day." Thorne left. Evelyn closed his chart and added it to the growing stack in her desk drawer. 4 men, 4 lives, 4 families shattered. And she could do nothing. In January 1944, 2 more men came to her office with the same complaints. Luther Quinby and Nelson Morse, both from Building K27, both showing the same symptoms, both sent to the hospital with the same diagnosis, both dead by April. 6 men in 6 months. Evelyn's notebook filled with names, dates, symptoms. She documented everything with medical precision. Part of her knew it was futile. This record would never be used, never be seen. But she kept writing anyway, because it was the only thing she could do. The only way to acknowledge that these men had existed, had suffered, had died. In February, Evelyn received a visit from the plant physician. Dr. Lawrence Cutler, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a precisely trimmed mustache. He sat across from her with his hat on his lap and spoke in a calm, reasonable tone. Quote, 75. Quote, 76. Quote, 77. Quote, 78. Cutler nodded slowly. Cutler removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully with a handkerchief. Quote, 83. Quote, 84. Quote, 85. Quote, 86. Quote, 87. Quote, 88. Cutler stood, replacing his hat. Quote, 89. Quote, 90. Quote, 91. Quote, 92. Quote, 93. He left. Evelyn sat at her desk, trembling with anger. Separate domains. Wartime necessity. Classified. Every door she tried to open was slammed in her face. The system was designed to protect itself, not the workers dying inside it. In March, 3 more men came to her office, all from Building K27, all with the same complaints. Evelyn no longer bothered calling the health department. She knew what the response would be. She simply documented the cases, ordered tests, sent the men to the hospital, and watched them die. By June 1944, 12 men had died. 12 names in her notebook. 12 families without fathers, brothers, sons. And the facility kept operating. The shifts kept running. New workers were hired to replace the dead ones. No one said anything. No one asked questions. Because it was wartime, and questioning the war effort was unpatriotic. Because the work was classified, and talking about it was illegal. Because the men who died signed secrecy agreements, and even in death, those agreements bound their families to silence. One evening in late June, Evelyn sat in her office after hours, looking at the notebook. 12 names. 12 men between the ages of 31 and 43. All dead within a year of developing symptoms. All worked in Building K27 at the Ridge plant. All diagnosed with acute leukemia. She knew what was happening. The men were being exposed to some kind of radiation. That was the only explanation that fit the pattern. Rapid onset, multiple victims, all from a single location, all developing the same blood disease. Radiation from processing radioactive materials. Building K27 must be where they handled those materials. Perhaps uranium, perhaps radium, perhaps something she'd never even heard of. Whatever it was killing them. And no one in authority cared because the war effort came first. Evelyn closed the notebook and locked it in her desk drawer. Then she went home, climbed the stairs to her apartment, and sat by the window watching the summer twilight fade over the town. She felt hollow inside, helpless, defeated. She had tried to fight the system, and the system had won. Not through violence, not through overt threats, simply through bureaucracy, classification, and the unassailable logic of wartime necessity. In July, 2 more men came to her office, Everett Polk and Dalton Briggs, both electricians in Building K27, both with the same symptoms. Evelyn barely spoke as she examined them. She filled out the test orders mechanically, handed them over, told them to go to the hospital. When they left, she sat at her desk and stared at the wall. 14. That night, a woman came to Evelyn's apartment. She knocked softly after dark, when the streets were empty. Evelyn opened the door to find a woman in her late 20s, thin and worn, wearing a faded dress and a worried expression. Evelyn stepped aside. Louise entered and stood in the small living room, clutching her purse with both hands. Louise perched on the edge of the sofa. 101. 102. 103. Louise twisted the strap of her purse. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, 107. 108. 109. 110. Louise's eyes filled with tears. So that's it? They just die and no one does anything? I'm sorry. My husband was 39 years old, Dr. Hartwell. We'd been married 15 years. We were planning to buy a house after the war, have another baby. And now he's gone. And no one will even tell me why. Evelyn reached across and took Louise's hand. Quote, 115. Quote. Louise wiped her eyes. Quote, 116. Quote. Quote, 117. Quote. Evelyn spoke quietly. Quote, Louise stared at her. Quote, Louise stood. After she left, Evelyn sat alone in the dark apartment. She felt sick. Sick with guilt, sick with anger, sick with the knowledge that she had just advised a grieving widow to stay silent about her husband's death. But what else could she say? The truth was, the government would crush anyone who tried to expose what was happening at the Ridge plant. The war gave them that power, and no court in America would rule against national security. Over the summer of 1944, Louise organized the other widows. They met quietly in each other's homes, sharing information, compiling lists of the dead and dying. They found 17 men who had worked in Building K27 and died of leukemia. 17 that they knew about. There might be more. In August, Louise came back to Evelyn's apartment with a handwritten list. We want to do something, Dr. Hartwell. Even if we can't go public, we want to document this, so that someday, when the war is over, people will know. Evelyn looked at the list. 17 names. 17 men between 28 and 45. All dead. What do you want me to do? Keep a record. You're a doctor. Your records mean something. Write down everything you know about each case. Medical facts, dates, symptoms. Make it official. It won't be official unless I can tie it to the facility. And I can't do that without access to their records. Then just write what you know. Please, Dr. Hartwell, don't let them disappear. That night, Evelyn began a new notebook. She went through her files, pulled every chart of every man who had died, and transcribed the relevant information. Name, age, occupation, date of first symptoms, diagnosis, date of death. Then she added the names from Louise's list, the men who had been patients of other doctors or who had died at the hospital without seeing a local physician first. By dawn, she had documented 23 cases. 23 men dead in just over a year. all from Building K-27. The notebook went into a locked box in the back of her closet. Hidden. Secret. Just another classified document in a town full of secrets. In September 1944, another man came to her office. Wallace Kern, 36, pipe fitter at Building K-27. Same complaints, same exam findings, same blood results. When Evelyn told him he needed to go to the hospital immediately, he just nodded. Quote, 129, quote, he said quietly. Quote, 130, quote, 131, quote, 132, quote, 133, quote. Wallace looked at her like she'd asked why he kept breathing. Because it's my job. Because there's a war on. Because they pay good money and my family needs it. What am I supposed to do, quit? If the work is killing you. Doc, men are dying on beaches in France, in jungles in the Pacific. At least I'm dying at home. At least my kids won't grow up thinking their dad was a coward who ran from his duty. He stood, took the hospital admission papers, and left. Evelyn sat motionless. What could she say to that? The man understood he was being sacrificed, and he was going to do it anyway, because that's what the country asked of him. Because questioning it would be unpatriotic. Because the war demanded sacrifice, and he would give it, even if the sacrifice was his life. By the end of 1944, Evelyn's notebook contained 31 names, 31 dead men in just over a year. And still the facility operated. Still the shifts continued. Still new workers were hired. The war in Europe and the Pacific ground on. News came of battles won and lost, of soldiers dying by the thousands, of cities bombed to rubble. Against that backdrop, 31 dead workers seemed like nothing. A rounding error. Acceptable losses in the machinery of war. In January 1945, Louise Brennan came to Evelyn's apartment for the last time. She looked exhausted, years older than her age. Quote, 137. Quote, 138. Quote, 139. Quote, 140. Louise reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. Quote, 141. Quote, Evelyn took the folder. Quote, Louise stood at the door looking back. Evelyn said honestly. Louise left. Evelyn never saw her again. The folder went into the locked box with the notebook. More secrets. More hidden truths that would never see light. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered. People celebrated in the streets, hung flags, rang church bells. The boys would be coming home. Except for the ones who wouldn't. Except for the ones buried in foreign soil. Except for the ones who died not in battle but in factories, poisoned by the weapons they were helping to build. In August, something happened that changed everything, though it took weeks for Evelyn to understand the significance. 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Cities obliterated in an instant. Tens of thousands dead. The power of the atom unleashed for the first time in warfare. The newspaper showed photographs of the mushroom clouds, described the unprecedented destruction. And buried in the technical articles explaining how atomic weapons worked were references to uranium, to enrichment, to radioactive materials. Evelyn sat in her apartment reading those articles and felt her blood turn cold. The Ridge Plant, Building K-27, radioactive materials. They had been working on the atomic bomb. Her patients, those 30-plus men who had died of radiation poisoning, had been part of the Manhattan Project. They had helped build the weapon that ended the war, and they had been killed by it, just as surely as if they'd been standing under the bomb when it fell. Now she understood why everything had been so thoroughly classified, why no investigation had been allowed, why everyone who tried to ask questions had been silenced. This wasn't just about industrial safety. This was about the most significant military secret of the war, the atomic bomb. And the men who died building it were collateral damage, acceptable losses in pursuit of ultimate victory. Evelyn felt something break inside her. She had known her patients were being sacrificed, but now she understood the scale of it. These men had died so that America could build the weapon that won the war. Their deaths were the price of victory, and no one would ever acknowledge it, because to do so would be to admit that American lives had been spent as carelessly as bullets, that the government had knowingly sent men to their deaths, that national security mattered more than human lives. In September 1945, another man came to her office. Leon Garrett, 34, formerly of Building K-27. Same complaints, same symptoms. Evelyn barely looked at him as she conducted the examination. She knew what she would find. She ordered the tests, waited for the results, confirmed what she already knew. "You have acute leukemia," she told him flatly. "You need to go to the hospital." "Will it help?" Leon asked. "No." "How long do I have?" "A few months, maybe less." Leon nodded slowly. "Thanks for being straight with me, Doc." He died in November, 32. The war was over. The boys came home. Bridgewater held parades. The Ridge plant shut down some operations, retooled others. Building K-27 was decommissioned in late 1945. Evelyn heard this through the grapevine. The plant physician, Dr. Cutler, mentioned it casually when they ran into each other at the pharmacy. "No longer needed," he said. "The project is complete. They're moving to other facilities, other locations." "How many men died in that building?" Evelyn asked. Cutler looked at her with cold eyes. "I don't discuss operational details, Dr. Hartwell, especially not with civilian practitioners." 32. That's how many came through my office. How many others were there? How many that I never saw? "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You knew what was happening in that building and you let it continue." "Dr. Hartwell, I understand you're upset. Losing patients is always difficult. But you need to understand that difficult decisions had to be made during the war. Sacrifices. Don't say that word to me. Don't you dare." Evelyn's voice shook. Quote 165. Quote 166. He walked away. Evelyn stood on the sidewalk outside the pharmacy, shaking with rage. But what could she do? The war was over. The bomb had worked. America had won. In the grand narrative of victory, 32 dead workers were a footnote no one would read. The years passed. 1946, 1947, 1948. Evelyn continued her practice. She treated colds and broken bones and pregnancies. She delivered babies and signed death certificates. She lived quietly, spoke to few people, kept to herself. The locked box in her closet remained locked, the notebook inside it untouched. Sometimes, walking through town, she would see a familiar face, a widow, a child who had lost a father. They would nod at each other, a silent acknowledgement of shared knowledge, shared grief. But no one spoke about it, not publicly, not even privately. It was over. The plant had moved on to new projects. The dead were buried and forgotten. In 1950, Evelyn retired from medical practice. She was only 46, but she felt ancient, worn out, finished. She sold her practice to a younger doctor and moved to a small house on the edge of town, where she lived alone with her books and her memories. The locked box came with her. Sometimes she would take out the notebook and read through the names. 32 men. No, more than that. She had kept adding names as she heard about them through Louise's network of widows, before Louise disappeared to North Carolina. 41 men in total. 41 lives. 41 families destroyed. All for a weapon that worked exactly as intended. In 1953, she heard that the government was building a new facility somewhere in Nevada. Atomic testing. They were going to detonate bombs in the desert, watch what happened, study the effects. The news made her laugh bitterly. They were going to study radiation effects now? A bit late for the men of Building K-27. In 1960, Evelyn developed arthritis. Her hands, which had once been steady enough to give injections and tie sutures, became gnarled and painful. She could no longer write easily. The notebook became harder to maintain. Not that it mattered. No one would ever read it anyway. In 1965, a journalist came to Bridgewater. He was writing a book about the Manhattan Project, interviewing people who had been involved. Someone, Evelyn never learned who, gave him her name. He knocked on her door on a bright spring morning, a young man in his 20s with earnest eyes and a tape recorder. "Dr. Hartwell? My name is David Morrison. I'm researching the civilian impacts of the Manhattan Project. I understand you treated workers from the Ridge plant during the war." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I have nothing to say to you. I've spoken with several widows who mentioned your name. They said you documented cases of radiation poisoning among workers in Building K-27. I'd very much like to see those records." "No. Dr. Hartwell, this is important. The public has a right to know what happened." "The public has a right to nothing. The government made that very clear 20 years ago. Everything about the Ridge plant is classified. Anyone who discusses it violates the Espionage Act. The war's been over for 20 years. Surely some information can be declassified now. Nothing will be declassified that makes the government look bad. Go away, Mr. Morrison." "But the families of those men deserve to know." Evelyn shut the door in his face. She stood in her hallway, heart pounding. For a moment she had been tempted to give him the notebook, to let him tell the story, to finally expose what had happened. But what good would it do? The men were still dead. The government would deny everything. The records were classified. No one could prove anything. And she was tired. So tired. She didn't have the energy to fight anymore. David Morrison came back 3 more times. Each time, Evelyn refused to speak with him. Finally, he gave up. His book was published in 1967. Evelyn found a copy at the library and read it. There was a chapter on health effects of radiation exposure. It mentioned that some Manhattan Project workers had suffered from radiation sickness, that safety protocols had been inadequate in the early years of the program. But there was nothing about Building K-27. Nothing about the men who had died. Nothing about the cover-up. The book treated it all as historical oversight, regrettable but understandable given the pressures of wartime. No one was blamed. No one was held accountable. Evelyn closed the book and returned it to the library. History, she thought bitterly, is written by people who weren't there. In 1970, Evelyn had a stroke. Mild, but it left her left side weakened. She could no longer live alone. A visiting nurse came daily to help with meals and bathing. The nurse was a cheerful woman named Patricia, who talked constantly about her family, her children, local gossip. Evelyn barely listened. She spent most of her time sitting by the window, looking out at the trees, thinking about nothing. In 1972, Patricia found the locked box while cleaning. "What's in here, Dr. Hartwell?" "Nothing. Put it back." "It's locked. Where's the key?" "I don't know. Lost it years ago." Patricia put the box back on the closet shelf. But the incident reminded Evelyn that she was mortal, that soon she would die, and the notebook would be found. What would happen to it? Would Patricia read it? Would she understand its significance? Would she try to do something with it? Evelyn hoped not. She hoped the notebook would be thrown away with the rest of her possessions, that it would end up in a landfill, that the names written in it would finally, truly disappear. Because that was what the government wanted. That was what the system required. And Evelyn was too old and too tired to fight it anymore. In 1975, Evelyn turned 71. Her health was failing. The visiting nurse came twice a day now. The doctor, the same young man who had bought her practice 25 years earlier, visited weekly and told her gently that her heart was giving out. She had perhaps a year left, maybe less. Evelyn accepted this news without emotion. She had lived long enough. Too long, perhaps. Long enough to watch the truth be buried so deep that it could never be excavated. Long enough to outlive everyone who had cared about that truth. Louise Brennan had died in 1968, Evelyn learned from a notice in the newspaper. Heart attack. She was 53. All those years of grief and anger had worn her body out. The other widows had scattered, died, or given up. The men themselves were all dead, every single one. Building K-27 was long gone, demolished in the early 60s when the plant underwent modernization. The physical evidence had been destroyed. Only the notebook remained. And soon, that would be gone too. In April 1976, Evelyn called her lawyer and had him write a will. She left her house to a cousin she barely knew. Her few possessions were to be sold, the proceeds donated to charity. There was no mention of the notebook, no special instructions. She wanted it to disappear, to be forgotten, just like the men whose names it contained. On June 3, 1976, Evelyn Hartwell died in her sleep. The visiting nurse found her the next morning, lying peacefully in bed, her face calm. She had been 72 years old. The cousin came from Ohio to settle the estate. He hired a company to clean out the house. They worked quickly, efficiently, throwing most things away. The locked box from the closet went into a dumpster along with old clothes, outdated medical textbooks, and 50 years' worth of accumulated possessions. No one opened it. No one read the notebook inside. The house was sold. The money went to charity. Evelyn Hartwell was buried in the town cemetery under a simple stone that read only her name and dates. No mention of her work. No mention of what she had tried to do. Just another forgotten life in a town full of secrets. And that should have been the end of the story. But in 1995, nearly 50 years after the end of World War II, the Department of Energy began declassifying documents related to the Manhattan Project. Thousands of pages of reports, memos, letters, technical specifications. Among those documents was a health survey conducted at the Ridge plant in 1946, after the war ended. The survey had been classified top secret and locked away for decades. Now it was released, buried in a massive document dump that few people had time to read. On page 347 of that survey was a single paragraph. Quote, 180, 47 cases, 43 deaths. The official numbers. More than Evelyn had documented in her notebook because some men had never made it to a doctor. They had simply stopped coming to work, died at home, been buried quietly. No one investigated. No one asked questions. The paragraph was noticed by a graduate student researching radiation exposure in nuclear facilities. She wrote a paper about it, published in an obscure academic journal that almost no one read. The paper mentioned the Ridge plant, Building K-27, the 43 deaths. It noted that the families had never been told the truth. It suggested that this represented a significant ethical violation by the government. The paper received no attention. No newspaper picked it up. No congressional committee launched an investigation. The men who had made the decisions in the 1940s were all dead by 1995. There was no one left to hold accountable. In 1998, the Ridge plant, which had operated continuously since 1940 under various configurations, was permanently closed. The site was turned over to the Environmental Protection Agency for cleanup. Contamination was found in the soil, in the groundwater, in the buildings themselves. Radioactive materials that had been improperly stored, improperly disposed of, had leaked into the environment over the course of 58 years. The cleanup would take decades and cost billions. In 2003, a memorial was erected in Bridgewater Town Square. A simple stone monument honoring quote, _181 __. No names were listed. No mention was made of how those workers had contributed or what their contribution had cost them. The stone bore a bronze plaque with an inscription, underscore underscore, quote underscore 182 underscore underscore. But it had been forgotten. Evelyn was dead. Louise was dead. The widows were dead. The men were dead. The notebook had been destroyed. The truth had been buried so deep that no one even knew it existed. In 2010, a local historian writing a book about Bridgewater's history during World War II tried to track down information about the ridge plant. She found the declassified health survey, read the paragraph about Building K-27, and attempted to identify the men who had died. But the records were incomplete. The plant's personnel files had been destroyed in the 1970s. The hospital where the men had been treated had closed in 1985, its records lost. She managed to track down 3 names from obituaries in old newspapers: Vernon Oakley, Clifford Brennan, Marlon Hutchins. 3 men out of 43. 3 families out of dozens. She tried to find descendants, to interview them, to learn their stories. But the families had scattered. Many had changed their names. Some had moved to different states, different countries even. The trail was cold. The historian included a footnote in her book, underscore underscore quote underscore 183 underscore underscore. That was all. A footnote. A sentence. 43 lives reduced to speculation and uncertainty. And perhaps that's how all tragedies end, in a world where secrets are valued more than truth. With footnotes, with uncertainties, with the slow erasure of memory until nothing remains but the faintest echo of what was once a scream of injustice. The ridge plant site remains a Superfund cleanup area. The contamination persists. In the groundwater beneath Building K-27's former location, radioactive isotopes will remain dangerous for thousands of years. Long after the last person who remembers the plant has died, long after the last widow has been buried, long after the last child who lost a father has been forgotten, the poison remains, the secret remains, the silence remains. And somewhere, in a landfill outside Bridgewater, under decades of accumulated trash, lies a locked box containing a notebook with 41 names written in careful, precise handwriting. Names that no one will ever read. Stories that will never be told. Lives that ended in pain and fear, and the bitter knowledge that their sacrifice meant nothing. That's the real tragedy. Not that the men died, death comes for us all, but that they died for nothing. They were told they were serving their country, contributing to victory, doing vital work. And they were. The atomic bomb did help end the war. It did save lives by avoiding an invasion of Japan. The mathematics of war made their deaths worthwhile. But worthwhile doesn't mean acknowledged, doesn't mean honored, doesn't mean their families were told the truth. The government took their lives and gave back nothing. No compensation, no explanation, no apology, just silence. And in that silence, the men disappeared, became non-people, became statistics that no one counted, casualties that no one mourned, victims of a crime that was never prosecuted because it was sanctioned by the state. That's how democracy dies, one silent death at a time. Not with bombs or tanks or declarations of martial law, just with bureaucrats who classify reports, lawyers who cite national security, and doctors who are told to keep quiet, with systems that protect themselves at the expense of the people they're supposed to serve. With the steady erosion of accountability until no one can be blamed for anything. Evelyn understood this by the end. That's why she stopped fighting. Not because she gave up on justice. She never believed in justice. But because she understood that the system was stronger than any individual, that silence was its most effective weapon, and that the best way to destroy truth was simply to wait until everyone who knew it was dead. She died believing her notebook would be destroyed, the names forgotten, the story lost. And she was right. The notebook was destroyed. The names were forgotten. The story was lost. Except for this. Except for the words you're reading now. This reconstruction based on the few fragments that survived, the declassified survey, the historian's footnote, the memorial in the town square. This attempt to recover what was deliberately erased, to speak the names of the dead even though we don't know them all, to acknowledge that they existed, that they suffered, that they were betrayed by the country they tried to serve. This is all that remains. Words. Inadequate, incomplete, too late. But words nonetheless. Because if we don't speak the names of the forgotten, they truly disappear. If we don't tell the stories that were silenced, they truly die. And if we don't demand accountability for crimes committed in the name of national security, then national security becomes just another phrase for, we can do whatever we want and no one can stop us. The men of Building K-27 are beyond justice now. They're beyond everything. But we're not. We're here, reading their story, learning what was done to them. And maybe that matters. Maybe remembering is its own form of justice. Maybe acknowledgement, even decades too late, is worth something. Or maybe it's not. Maybe this is just more words, more inadequacy, more too late hand-wringing that changes nothing. Maybe the real lesson is that power always wins, that secrets are always kept, that the machinery of state grinds on regardless of individual suffering. Maybe there are no lessons at all. Just 43 dead men, 43 grieving families, and one doctor who tried to do something and failed. Just another tragedy in a century full of tragedies, forgotten because there are always new tragedies to replace the old ones. Just the endless cycle of sacrifice and silence, patriotism and betrayal, duty and death. Just America, doing what America does, winning wars, keeping secrets, moving forward, and leaving the bodies behind.